Hi, it's Hannah here from the My Planet, My Voice team. Welcome to Climate 101, your 3-part guide to understanding the basics of climate change and what you can do to be part of the solution. In part 1, we went over what climate change is and how human activity causes it. So in part 2,
Boo! Boo! Boring!
Who are you? I'm Hannah, obviously. No, I'm Hannah. Well, I'm Hannah from another dimension where you're not a massive nerd. Caring about climate change is for losers. Oh, please no food or drink. Ah, interesting. You don't believe in climate change? Oh no, I totally do. Climate change is for sure happening. Then how is caring about it for losers? Because you're blowing it way out of proportion. I mean, how bad could a couple of degrees of warming really be? I, for one, think we could use a little more sunshine. Yeah, I'm not sure that's how that works. Nature's a delicate balance, and messing with it could have serious consequences. Whatever. It's not like you're some kind of expert on climate change. True, but I did speak with someone who is. Check this out.
You know, when we think about climate change, definitely just the planet warming is one of the big impacts, and that ends up precipitating a lot of other changes.
This is Professor Justine Law, an ecologist and environmental scientist who teaches at Sonoma State University. I spoke with her to learn what impacts that climate change due to global warming can have on our environment.
So right now, we're at about 1 degree Celsius of overall warming of the planet, which is, nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when it comes to the whole planet, that actually matters quite deeply. First of all, it means water is going to evaporate much more off the surface. And so when we think about things like drought here in California, it causes us to get drier, not just here, but around other parts of the world. And then as more water is evaporating, there's more water in the atmosphere. And so then you have a lot more floods, heavy precipitation events in other places. But also more carbon just ends up meaning more energy in the atmosphere. And energy is what drives weather and extreme weather events. So the more energy you add, the more you would expect to see hurricanes, for example, be more intense than they were in the past. This was the warmest summer, right, on record in many places, or like we said, 116 degrees in Santa Rosa. But most likely this will be the coolest part of this century, actually. And so things are only going to continue to get, hotter, drier, potentially more wildfires, more of these sorts of changes. They're only going to keep increasing. And so what climate change really does is just make it much, much more likely that you're going to have extreme weather events, that they're going to occur with more frequency and more intensity than they did in the past.
But climate change also has significant impacts on other parts of the natural world. For example, our planet's oceans are being dramatically affected by global warming, leading to problems like sea level rise and acidification.
Just as the Earth and the atmosphere is warming, the oceans are also absorbing that heat. And so with oceans warming, sea level rise is and is going to be a really big problem. As things warm, the molecules start moving a lot faster and the water expands. And so partially sea level rise is caused by thermal expansion. And then the other part is ice sheet melt. So the ice that's stored on the land of Greenland and Antarctica, as that melts, that water is now being added to the ocean, whereas before it was locked up on the land.
Warming oceans also have a big impact on the health of ocean life.
Many people have heard of coral bleaching, and that's when, because the ocean is warming, the corals, when they start to get too warm, they cast off the algae that used to live in a symbiotic relationship with those corals. And then the other thing is that as carbon dioxide is absorbed, it becomes carbonic acid, and then the oceans become more acidic than they were before.
Why is ocean acidification a problem? Here's one example. The coral we just mentioned? It has a critical role in ocean ecosystems. Corals build their hard, stony skeletons out of calcium carbonate. Corals may not form calcium carbonate under increased acidity, and under severe acidity, the coral skeleton can dissolve. Thus, the effect of increased ocean acidity on one type of organism can have serious consequences for an entire ecosystem, including people. Okay, now back to the impacts of sea level rise.
The way that models are looking right now around sea level rise is that we're likely to hit at least a couple feet, if not more, like a meter of sea level rise by the end of this century. Billions of people on Earth live quite close to a coast, and if the sea level rises, that means you've got to either figure out ways to adapt if the community and government has resources to make that happen, or you're stranded and you've got to figure out somewhere else to go.
Both extreme weather and sea level rise affect the environment in increasingly severe ways. But they're just a couple examples of the many impacts of human-caused climate change. And what's worse is that these impacts are changing our planet way too fast for the ecosystem to adapt.
We're at 1 degree Celsius right now, approximately, of warming. Most people would say that if things don't change, we're looking at more like 4 to 5 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. Climate's always changed through time, but it's changed over hundreds of years, or even more likely thousands of years. And so when it changes over decades, species can't adapt to those changes in some cases. There'll be some species that do okay, that are generalists and can kind of live in lots of different habitats, but overall biodiversity certainly is going to go down. And that matters for a whole range of reasons. Species are doing all kinds of stuff for us, like they're purifying water and they're keeping soils stable. Pollination of bees and things matters so much for agriculture. And so to rebuild or to build the infrastructure of everything that non-human species provides for us would be like the global economy so many times over, right, to make that possible. Ecosystems are such intricately connected webs, right, that any particular tug on that web is going to reverberate throughout the ecosystem. Without a resilient ecosystem and biodiversity that's supporting that resilience, then it creates a lot of problems, right, throughout that entire web.
Whoa. What? How'd you do that? Movie magic. I don't even know what that means. Nah, don't think about it too much. So, how do you feel about what we just watched? Yeah, that actually seems like it could be really bad. Yeah, see? Climate change is a big problem for the environment. Okay, well, I still don't see why I should care. It's not like it's gonna affect my life. Actually, it will affect your life, and it's affecting all of our lives right now in different ways. Climate change impacts people just as much as the planet. And I suppose you just conveniently have another reputable source to talk about it. Why, yes I do. Fine. Roll the tape. What is tape?
To learn what impacts climate change can have on people and communities, I spoke with Ofelia Bello, Executive Director of Youth United for Community Action. This grassroots organization based in East Palo Alto empowers youth to address environmental and social justice issues in their community by organizing to create positive systemic change.
How does climate change impact people and the communities that they live in?
The ways that it impacts the folks who live in our community is first and foremost our health. And being a working class community, a majority working class community, being able to be healthy and go to work to provide for our families is foundational to us just being able to live a somewhat stable life. Being in one of the cities in the Bay Area that has experienced a lot of environmental racism in the past, we already have super disproportionate rates of asthma among our children and young people. And to have those added layers of climate change impacts added to our daily lives is really tough. It means sometimes it affects your health and you can't go to school, or if you're an adult and it affects your health, you can't go to work.
Let's go over some terminology. What is environmental racism? It means that things like toxic waste dumps, hazardous facilities, and landfills are more likely to be built near low-income communities and communities of color, often leading to a higher likelihood of illness, disease, or other negative health outcomes for people in those communities. So, why is that? Well, remember when we talked about sacrifice zones in episode 1?
Burning fossil fuels and creating fossil fuels creates a lot of pollution and waste. That waste has to go somewhere.
You need disposable land to put these polluting facilities on, and you can't have disposable land without disposable people. Systemic racism enables decision makers to build these facilities near communities that are deemed disposable. Also, environmental racism is just as much about what is not present in a community as what is. For example, low-income communities in urban areas tend to have less tree coverage, which means that when there's a heat wave, homes are much more likely to get too hot to be livable. Environmental racism is a global issue too, with entire countries being treated as sacrifice zones. So what other issues does climate change intersect with? Food and housing are just a few.
There's definitely a lot of layers that connect food insecurity to the political landscape of our community, but we also see it as a sort of connection to our global community. What does it mean when we can't find such and such fresh vegetables that are really integral parts of a lot of like cultural dishes that people eat here because there's a drought in Mexico, or because there's a drought in some other country, or because there's a shortage on the workers because people can't work in the conditions that they usually work in California because of wildfires. Like, all of those things connect. And when we think about what it takes to maintain a roof over your head and be stabilized in a home, we think about the fact that when it gets really cold, when our winters get colder and our summers get hotter, the housing stock that we live in is not prepared for those sort of weather climate fluctuations. It means that your utility bills are going to be higher, and when you're a low-income community or a low-income family, to take it down to the family unit, for example, who is already really, doing what we can to make ends meet, little things like that make an impact. You take those trends into account when you think about the added impacts of now seeing wildfires, unfortunately pretty regularly in the summer, and experiencing the burden of having our air quality be very poor when the wind blows the smoke this way. Those are added sort of impacts that none of us could really foresee. Even if we might not have the scientific jargon or like all of the technical terminology to describe it, we definitely feel it, see it, smell it, and can touch it sometimes. So it's definitely here, and I think more and more folks are becoming aware that that's a byproduct. All of those things are byproducts of climate change.
While these impacts will continue to have more and more serious effects on all of us, it's also really important to recognize that they don't affect everyone equally.
We as a country, as a world really, have signed up for climate catastrophes that we can't even foresee right now. And it feels heavy to say that, but I think it's true. There's no negating it. We've seen devastating floods in the Middle East. We've seen droughts in a number of different countries. We've seen really devastating heat waves in different cities here in the United States. The thing about climate change is climate doesn't discriminate. The catastrophes that we see taking place globally, it's indiscriminate. But they're definitely disproportionately felt by Indigenous, Black, African American, youth of color, low-income people, and it really traces back to policies and practices that our cities, our governments have intentionally made over the years, whether it's redlining, which East Palo Alto is a community that was redlined.
Here's another spot to define some terminology. Redlining has come to mean racial discrimination of any kind in housing, but it comes from government maps that outlined areas where Black residents lived and were therefore deemed risky investments for home ownership programs. It's an example of disinvestment that shaped what our communities look like today and impacted who has access to resources.
Whether it's redlining or segregationist policies or just environmental racism, lower income communities of color or Indigenous communities don't get all of the support for recovery and therefore experience the brunt of climate change first and for longer.
Man, this is way more serious than I thought. And honestly, a little scary. I mean, how are we even supposed to solve a problem that's this big? I hear ya. It can feel overwhelming, but don't get too discouraged because in part 3 of this series, we're going to cover what we can do to make an impact and how you can get involved with others in this movement. Okay, well, maybe I'll check it out. And I guess I may have been a little harsh earlier when I called you a massive nerd. I think I kind of get it now. And I'm sorry for being rude or whatever. Aw, that's okay. I accept your apology. And I'm definitely not just saying that because you're a fictional character that I created for the sole purpose of making this video more interesting. Yeah, I'm definitely real. Reconciliation high five? Sure, bring it in, buddy. Whoa, I think I just absorbed the other Hannah's essence into my own. How is that even possible? Well, that was fun. Thanks for watching part 2 of Climate 101. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to see more climate content, and leave a comment below to tell us what you want to see next. Until then, stay loud, be heard, and let's save this planet together.